Hello class and welcome to week 3 of movement anatomy. This week we are reviewing the elbow, wrist, and hand. The anatomical structures you're responsible for every week will be pretty much the same as this week, where you're learning origins, insertions, and innervations and little specific anatomical landmarks. So let's start with the elbow and radial ulnar joints. And we're dealing with the humerus, ulna, and radius. Make sure to review the landmarks on each of these bones. So these little specifics will orientate you when examining a patient, and it will also help you understand the proper movement of each bone against each other. In turn, you'll be able to recognize malalignments during acute injuries and where chronic injuries are stemming from. So, for example, the medial epicondyle, as you can see here, sticks out a little bit more than the lateral epicondyle. So knowing this will help you figure out what side you're looking at and where all the other structures are. So you'll understand that if this is the medial side, then this has to be the ulna, because the ulna is always on the medial side when looking at someone from anatomical position. Therefore, if this is the ulna, this is the coronoid process. So on the humerus, this has to be the coronoid fossa, because the coronoid process sits in the coronoid fossa inflection. One of the other more common landmarks on the ulna is the olecranon process, and in full extension, the olecranon process will sit right in the olecranon fossa of the humerus. As for the major ligaments, at the elbow, the ulnar collateral ligament or the medial collateral ligament provides the primary stability for valgus forces, at least the anterior and the posterior bundles. Now the radial collateral ligament connects the lateral epicondyle to the radius and the annular ligament, as you can see on this side. And the radial collateral ligament, the lateral ulnar collateral ligament provides varus stability as well, especially when the elbow is in a flexed position. And at the radial ulnar joint, the annular ligament, so you can kind of see it right here and in this figure right here as well. It forms an almost complete circle around the radial head, so it provides a lot of the support in keeping the head in the radial notch of the ulna, so that there's no subluxation during any of the movements. As for movements of the elbow and radial ulnar joints, we have flexion extension, and then we have pronation and supination. These two are at the radial ulnar, these two are at the elbow joints. The musculature that performs these movements are seen here, along with some other muscles of the forearm, which we'll discuss later. But one of the things that is discussed in your textbook is that the anterior portion of the elbow forearm produces flexion and pronation, whereas the posterior and posterior portion of the musculature provides extension and supination. If we're strictly talking about flexors, extensors, pronators, and supinators, here's an easy way to kind of organize all the movements by what muscles are providing each of the movements. So something that comes up as a little bit unusual is that the brachioradialis provides pronation and supination. So they're counterintuitive, but this depends on what position the elbow begins flexing, because the primary movement that the brachioradialis does is flexion, elbow flexion, and depending on what position you begin in flexion, that's what the brachioradialis will try to correct, because it wants to stay neutral. So if you begin flexion with the arm in pronation, then it's going to be more of a supinator, and vice versa. So moving on to the wrist and hand. Here we have the bones that make up wrist and hand. Again, we see the radius and ulna. We have 8 carpal bones, 5 metacarpal, bones and 14 phalanges. A commonly known bone of the wrist is the scaphoid because anytime there's a wrist injury, as in falling on an outstretched arm, this bone can easily get fractured. It's on your thumb side, and the problem with that bone is, or any of the carpals, is that they have very little vasculature, as in they don't have a lot of blood supply. So it's very hard for them to heal. Anytime there's a potential fracture to the wrist, it's very important to rule out a fracture to that bone because it typically requires surgery where, if it's a non-union fracture, you're going to have to get pins, wires, and even that may not help it heal all the way. At, at last resort, sometimes they use bone stimulators to try to help the bone kind of fully heal. Next, we have the joints that make up the wrist and hand, and we have the carpometacarpal joints, the metacarpophalangeal (MCP) joints. We also have a proximal interphalangeal joint and distal interphalangeal joints. And something interesting to notice is that 4 of the 5 phalanges have the PIP and DIP joints. However, at the thumb, there's only interphalangeal joints because there's only the metacarpophalangeal and then 1 interphalangeal joint there. As for movements, at the wrist we have flexion, extension, ulnar deviation, and radial deviation. And as the name states, the deviation or the movement occurs to the radius if it's radial deviation. And if it's ulnar deviation, the movement moves towards the ulna. So this would be more of like a movement laterally, and this would be a movement medially. And then at the fingers, we have flexion, extension, but they also have adduction and abduction. This next illustration here is a cross-section of the wrist, which shows us the musculature grouped together and the limited space that we have. The flexor digitorum superficialis and flexor digitorum profundus tendons are grouped here together in a space called the carpal tunnel, which is created by the hamate, capitate, the trapezoid, the trapezium, and other tissue around these tendons. But of note here is the median nerve. This nerve is the cause of carpal tunnel syndrome. So anytime you have inflammation, disruption of any of these tendons or the tissue around here that causes inflammation, it's going to press on this median nerve, and that's what's going to give you numbness and tingling, maybe even shooting pain down the last 2 fingers of your hand. And again, here we have our flexors on the anterior side and the extensors on the posterior side. Figures A through C show you the anterior side, with each slide going deeper. So from more superficial here to showing you the deeper flexor groups. And finally, D shows you the posterior side with the deeper muscles exposed, and then you have the extensor digitorum, the extensor digiti minimi, and the extensor carpi ulnaris. They have been cut here to expose these deeper muscles. And here's just illustration of some of these deeper muscles, and also showing part of the brachial plexus with the ulnar nerve exposed here. And as you can see here, it passes on the medial side of the elbow. And any irritation to that nerve will give you numbness, tingling down your medial elbow as well. And that's kind of what people refer to as the funny bone. So like anytime you hit the inside of your elbow, you get this numbness and tingling going down your arm. And finally, I wanted to show you this slide here of the brachial plexus. I know you guys have maybe looked at this in your textbook, but here it kind of just breaks everything down from the roots, trunks, divisions, cords, and branches. And like I mentioned before, at the wrist, you have the median nerve, and you can see that it begins with four of the five roots, C6 through T1, all end up being part of the median nerve right here. So just kind of wanted to show you that to help you understand why it's important to know the brachial plexus and how it affects, not just the shoulder, but also the elbow and the wrist, how it's all kind of connected there. But that's all I have for you this week. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm hoping that you guys feel a little bit more comfortable with the quizzes. But remember, it's a small percentage of your total grade. I definitely want you guys to do well. But if you're kind of still struggling with that, make sure you reach out to the Academic Success Center. But if it's something related to the topics that we're covering weekly, please reach out to me so we can discuss it. So have a great week, and I wish you guys the best.